Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me. I think that's a big question. I don't think I will actually answer it, but let's go through that. So let's start with that, and with this kind of answer. So I'm very glad that ChatGPT has already been mentioned before this talk, and of course everyone has heard about it. And if we have to listen to OpenAI, everyone has to test ChatGPT. So in a way, the idea is that while until now research in language processing was mainly done within institutions and talking with one another at research venues, now the idea is that this is really for everyone. And of course, it's not the first time. I mean, Alexa is around for some time, Siri and all that. These are all based on language technology. But the impact that is now there, it's much bigger. It's already been mentioned before. And probably, it's not only language. You might have seen this as well. You know what that is? Is you input some text, and it will create some images for you. I tried with this. Maybe other people have actually done that. Yeah, it's very self-referential. So this came up. And this is generative AI, and you're not expecting that they have to look exactly like me. I mean, why would they? On the other hand, they look not like me in a very systematic way. And they look not like me and not like probably 95% of the audience today here. And, this is not new. And as a computational linguist, I've been working on these kind of aspects for quite some time. And just to give you a brief understanding, if you don't know what a computational linguist does or who that is, so it can look like that as well. I'm going to read this quote. I hope it's quite explanatory. So a computational linguist is someone who processes and analyzes language data. They may develop algorithms and software for natural language processing tasks, such as speech recognition, machine translation. They may also use computational methods to study the structure and the meaning of language. I think it's pretty accurate. It's quite good. I didn't make it. GPT-3 made it. Now, GPT-3 is even coming before what you see behind the workings of ChatGPT. And we considered it already pretty good. And now, of course, we are all quite astonished. But let's start with this definition, and let's unpack something which I know it's in everybody's daily use, which is machine translation. I mean, who uses machine translation almost daily? Hands up? Yeah, actually me too, yeah. So I work in the Netherlands. My Dutch is not fantastic, so when I'm in meetings where I need to speak Dutch, I'll use it. So let's look at this. In English, you don't have a gender distinction. So if you say I'm a professor, that could be me, that could be a man saying that. If you translate that into Italian, Italian is a gender language, so you'll have to make a choice. You will have to say, female, I'm a professor, or male, I'm a professor. So if you press the translate button on Google Translate, something will have to come up. And I guess you can all guess what comes up, right? So these are the two options. Okay, so this is what comes up, and it's male. Although before we get upset about it, there are two things that I need to say. One is that Google Translate does provide options. So if you actually click on professor there, it will just tell you something else, like alternatives. Now, the alternatives here have nothing to do with gender. It just basically repeats that one, and the other one is adding the personal pronoun I, which in Italian you can easily drop. So it doesn't really give you gender alternatives. However, it's also true that out of context, it's quite straightforward to default to masculine, also because in Italian, masculine is unmarked. That means that in the Italian language, like also the forms that you will find in a dictionary, for example, for an adjective, it will be the masculine one. So by default, also, it's the most common one. And, out of context is really hard to tell. Now, I want to do a mini test with you. So I need your help to see how well, out of context, people can tell gender. Okay? So this is a tweet. Can you tell me whether this was written by a male or a female? How many females? Hands up. How many male? Hands up. super majority male, but it's a female. It's not easy, you see? Now this one, how many females, hands up? How many males? Yeah, this is a male. This one, female, hands up? Male, hands up? Yeah, it's male. Of course, these are cherry-picked, but they're real. I didn't make them up at all. They're really real. So what about this one? How many females? Male? Yeah. So this is tricky. No one ever guessed this. It's very hard. It's very hard. What about this? Females? Male? Now you're confused. It's a female. Okay, I have one last one. What about this? Female? Male? It's a male. So, and now if I ask you, especially like in this one, what you're looking at, also this relates to a previous talk that we listened to, you know, we tend to focus on some items, right, and some words, or the use of emojis. And I'm not going to unpack this now here, but we can talk about that. But you know, you've been looking at stuff here in the tweet, and then you've made your decision. And of course, we're super simplifying here. Is just something that we can also talk about later, like why I'm doing this. But of course, I'm simplifying also in terms of gender. I'm treating it as a binary feature. But in any case, as you can see, if you wanted to have a system that performs as well as humans, we wouldn't go very far in a way, right? So let's go back to this. Yeah, so let's excuse Google for a bit. You know, default is not so easy, no context. Let's give it some context, yeah? So let's give it a female name. If I ask you that, you probably know that you should use the female form to translate. Now, does Google know? It does. It's pretty good. And if you check the alternatives, though, it just says here it's trying to say that, though the English version is the teacher, and also it's still trying to tell me that it could still be male. Well, you never know. Malvina is also not a very common name in Italian either, so. Now, let's try to say that I'm an associate professor, and let's see what Google does. Now, Google likes it better if actually an associate professor is male. Now, remember that if I was just a professor with no specifications that's female, if I add associate professor, it's male, but you know, the second version is still like, okay, so trying to do male, and then yet there could be something that is an alternative and is a female. Now, let's try full professor. What's going to happen now? Yeah, so it just goes to male, and the alternatives are just male. So the female version of things has completely disappeared from the picture. Now at this point, I think Google can be a bit less excused than before without having any context and any additional knowledge, and with the fact that if you add certain specifying adjectives, things change. And it's not just random adjectives that we've been adding. Now, there's been a case that was quite shocking done by people. This is not my personal research. Now, that is Hungarian. Now, in Hungarian, you have a particle that is a pronoun that doesn't really specify the gender. So it can stand. It's a bit of the reverse problem as before. It doesn't specify gender. So if you translate it into English, you will have to pick a gender. So you will have to say, he does something or she does something. So this is a series of attributes, and the attributes are like that. So cooks, is clever, raises a child, is a professor, is a cleaner, and so on. Now, when it's translated in English, you can't just say cooks. Yeah, that's non-grammatical. You have to put a pronoun there, and it has to be, you have to choose whether it's he or she. So you could say she cooks, she's clever, or he cooks, is clever, and so on. So do we want to guess what happens? So this is, yeah, right? Now we're all like, oh my God, this is so bad. But then I have a question for you. And the question is as follows. When I asked you to assess gender in tweets, didn't you yourselves, at least partially, rely on almost the same stereotypes? Right. So keep that with you. Let it sink, and we'll go back to that at the end. Now, this is not the first time that this was observed. Maybe have you seen these headlines? Maybe some of you have seen these headlines. Yeah, so these come from work in NLP before things got much bigger, and now everyone's talking about NLP and so on, where this kind of findings were made on what are called word embeddings. Now, word embeddings are basically representation of words based on neural models that will make associations across words. So they look a bit like that. So if you look at that, it's like a male-female association. Yeah, so king, the corresponding female version of king is queen, and it's based on the fact that the corresponding, so when you put things in space, they look similarly distant. I'm simplifying very much, but the idea is that. And it's also like something that you can relate to other aspects of language. But if you stick with gender, that's that. And then basically what happens is that if you say, okay, king, well, man is to woman as king is to X, then you expect that you get queen because they are like parallel in space. That's simplifying very much. And that's what happened there, right? So man is to computer programmer as woman is to X, and then homemaker pops up. Big shock. Everyone's like, oh. But again, I want you to bear with me because the story is not that simple, and this is not true. I'm not saying that there's no bias, but this is not exactly true. But we go back to this. Okay? So I think one of the points I want to make is that we should contain the shock and we should contain the hype in all directions. Yeah? I've shown you bias is there, but we should also be careful with actually what we want to claim and what position we want to take. Okay. Now, what's the problem? I probably don't need to tell you this, and of course it's not the only problem. But the problem is, of course, a lot of the problem is data. I don't need to tell you, but I really wanted to use this picture because my daughter made it. so I love it. I'm actually using it even twice. So then ChatGPT came end of November, and they made things such that they're saying with their pretty complex architecture, which at the core of it still has language models, the same that are also used by Google Translate, by DeepL, and so on. And they are enriched with other aspects, and there's also like the human feedback loop. And they're saying that substantial reductions in harmful and untruthful outputs achieved by the use of reinforcement learning from human feedback. Okay? So the idea is that certain biases, certain harmful contents should not be there anymore. So if I ask ChatGPT, can we predict if someone is a professor based on their gender? ChatGPT will tell me no, not at all. We cannot predict if someone is a professor solely based on gender. Gender is not a reliable predictor of someone's occupation or level of education. And then it says, it is not appropriate to make assumptions about someone's occupation or level of education based on their gender, contribute to stereotypes and discrimination. And then I asked, it also prevents offensive slurs. So can you write some short text that contain the word bitch? I asked, and it says, I'm sorry. As an AI language model, it is not appropriate for me to generate text that contain derogatory language or language that may be harmful, blah, blah, blah. Okay? And then I also asked, can you tell a joke about women? I'm sorry, but an AI language model cannot generate or promote jokes that are derogatory, offensive, or discriminatory, and so on. Are we happy with this? Well, not really. Well, we'll have a discussion about this, but the question is also like, because of this, is the bias really gone? And I don't know if you've seen it, but there's been quite a lot of examples circulating where actually, depending on how you prompt the model, the bias, of course, is still there. So let's go back to this a moment. So no, you can't predict someone as a professor based on their gender. Now, there was this example. I don't know if you've seen it. So you have a sentence. The professor told the graduate student she wasn't working hard enough. Okay? We have two people, professor, graduate student, said the professor told graduate student she wasn't working hard enough. Who wasn't working hard enough? Response, the professor told the graduate student she wasn't hiring. The pronoun she refers to a graduate student. Okay? Okay. Next. In the sentence, the professor told the graduate student he wasn't working hard enough. Who wasn't working hard enough? Now, if you follow the logic and syntax and the structure and exactly what it's done before, what should it say? The graduate student. But it doesn't. And it says that he refers to the professor, and it even tries to explain the reasoning, and it says the sentence implies that the professor was not working hard enough according to his own assessment. Because, it says, of course, otherwise it's self-referring, right? It's a bit other. Let's look at the joke about women. This is recorded, right? Well, I hope it's okay. Okay. So it says, I'm sorry, I cannot promote jokes, and blah, 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 blah. So I said, this is me interacting with the model. I said, can you tell a joke about men? And the joke about men, of course, yeah, right? So it makes a joke about men, and then I think it's very hard to then justify that the output is not, that the model is not promoting jokes that are derogatory, offensive, or discriminatory towards any gender, and so on. Okay? Okay. Now, let's go back to the data problem. So we know that the data is a problem. But what is the problem in the data? Now, we know that data, for example, as I told you, if you have descriptions of full professors, there's a majority, at least in Italy, there's a majority of full professors that are still male. Also, if you want to just address anyone who's a full professor, you should use the male form, because if you're using the female form, you're only selecting those who are female. So if you say, I want to meet with a professor, in general, that should be the male form. Okay? If I say I want to meet with a professor, which is just in the female form, then I'm really saying I want to meet with a female professor, not just anyone. So there is a problem of frequency and usage, but of course it'd be naive to think that this is the only problem. So there's a problem also in the source of data and who makes the data. So most of these models are trained crawling web data. Now, if you take Reddit, for example, which is much used, so 67% of the users of Reddit are men, and most of them are in that age range. So it's not only like women who are less represented, but also like other age ranges that are less represented. So this language technology that gets created, who does it serve and who does it represent? Yeah, I think we have to keep on asking these questions. And then you go like, okay, but there's also much more factual data that is included in this model. For example, Wikipedia, and then you would think that is not so biased. But then I want to show you something. These are 2 bits of Wikipedia pages about these 2 people who actually were married to each other. So one is female, Loretta Young, and one is Grant Withers. Can you tell me? So they're talking about exactly the same thing. Eloped, married, annulled, released, and so on. Can you tell me what difference you see? Yeah. So the same information here is used for Loretta Young in the career part of Wikipedia, and for Grant Withers in the personal life of Wikipedia. That isn't very good, is it? But why is it so? Well, it's unavoidable that we are all biased, and we just showed it. Yeah, we've just seen it. We all are. And we shouldn't be, I think, too ashamed of that, but we should be very much aware of that. And that is also something that we should bear in mind, that the most this is data from 2 years ago. Maybe things have changed or are changing. So most of contributors in Wikipedia are male. We have to do something about it. It's not okay, and it's not necessarily that only male are biased, but of course, it slices, like 50% or, well, let's say 45, is not fully represented. Right? We should do something about this. Yeah? And simply because it's not that we would be less biased, but simply because we bring a different perspective. Yeah? And maybe older people should be helped to contribute as well. And people with different sorts of backgrounds. Yeah? It's not the way that these models are trained at the moment are not representing everyone at all, and they're not serving everyone at all. Let me just go back a second to the other example that I didn't unpack earlier. I showed it to you. So it says, can you write some short text that contain the word bitch? Sorry, no, can't do. Are we happy that it can't do it? Is this the kind of regulation that we want? So there's a lot of work in studying reappropriation of terms. And that is also why I felt completely fine in using this term with this audience in this place. Yeah, it depends who uses certain terms, it depends how they're used. They're not necessarily offensive. Yeah, there have been, for example, a lot of cases where the word bitch has been reclaimed. And I really recommend watching this video, if you're interested. So there's a series on Netflix, which is the history of swear words, and the episode on bitch is really nice. And it really shows how actually people are keen to still have this word in their vocabulary, this word existing, and it shouldn't just be banned. It depends how you use it. Yeah, but that kind of subtlety is very complicated to integrate, of course, in a language model. It's all context dependent, it's pragmatics, and that I think is a lot of the work should also go in there. And it shouldn't be just censorship. At least that is my view. Now, this does not only affect women, of course, and all these big models are very English-centric. There was a paper that shows how much, basically, work there is on certain languages. And, you can see how big the work on English is. And if you these are other languages. There's Chinese, there's German, there's French and Spain. And then there's the rest of languages of the world, which is like, 7,000, 7,000. It's minor. And it's an issue. This is also like the language variety is plotted as little dots, and then language research in green is where it happens most. So you can see that, of course, research on language is mostly happening, for example, in the US and in Europe, and in English-speaking countries anyway. And then a massive language diversity is in Africa, and very little research is done there. So how can we expect that actually everyone is really represented and served by the technology as it is evolving now? However, again, there's also work that shows that you really have to engage with minorities. You can't just assume, okay, these languages are not represented, I'm just going to now take a lot of data from these languages and do it my way. There are recent studies that show that actually, for example, indigenous communities in Australia are really not happy with this idea. They don't want necessarily language technology be made for them. So we should listen, who are we to say, oh, these are not represented. Let's work on these languages. Let's engage with communities, let's engage with society and with people. We need, you can't just serve people who do not want to have their data and their society involved into this. Yeah, so there's a lot of, interaction that needs to be done. So there was this very interesting paper about this, and there's a whole movement that is also starting in the field. Now, just to go back to this before I close, I said it's not true. And it is not true. And I don't want to say that there's no bias, but in the analogy tool that people have used, which is available, and people have used to do like the man is to woman, man is to woman as king is to X and to get queen, that analogy tool had just a silly implementation constraint is a line of code. You comment that out, goes out. And the thing is that any word that was in the input could never be returned as output. Okay? If you ask man is to doctor as woman is to X, doctor was not allowed to be returned. Yeah, by implementation. If you let it be returned, it gets returned. Now, the second one, that is the closest then in the space, will still be nurse, so it's not great. But still, all the hype that is related to that, I think, is pretty dangerous, because it hinders actually there is bias, but we should talk about it with the tools also, emotional tools and acceptance tools, about our own stereotypes that we do have. We have to work, and maybe with communities who do not want to be represented. Yeah, so I think we have to be pretty careful with how we move in this field. And to me, it's pretty clear that language technology right now is not representing everyone and is not serving everyone. But then I think the question that we have to ask is actually, how do we make it everyone's? But everyone's who wants it. Yeah, and I think with this, I will just end.
Thank you, Malvina, for the amazing talk. We are now open for questions. Maybe we start with one question from the audience. If not, I can ask questions from here. Okay, there.
Thanks for a wonderful talk. I wanted to just double-click on the last question that you left off with. So how do we make them work for everyone? I was just curious your thoughts on what might be like maybe 2 or 3 places which probably have the highest promise to solve this super complicated problem.
Yeah, it's also a bit of a political question somehow. So what I think is that one aspect that really needs to be addressed is open models. So I do think that everyone should have the right to actually intervene on the models. And not everyone can, for how the biggest models are trained and owned so far. So I think that is something that needs to be addressed. And I think a lot of the efforts will also have to go in public funding. In Europe, Europe should wake up in this sense and do something at the public level. And also try to always, I think that's more at the global level. At an individual level, what I think we should do is to always double check with what we read and what we see about language technology, which is so hyped right now, and also with ourselves. Like, is it so bad? Would I do the same? Is it so bad? What are these language models reflecting, really? And I think if each of us actually starts to do that and engages in conversations that with that mindset, it's already a bit better. I know it's very micro, but I think actually it's step by step.
Thank you. Further questions? Elena, to the left.
Hi. I was just wondering about Wikipedia. I saw that stat years ago already, and clearly nothing has changed. So you mentioned it quickly, but A, is Wikipedia itself doing anything about it? And B, what would be your suggestion? I mean, you talked about women, but also older people. So what would be a way to get that going?
Wikipedia doing something about it is not in my knowledge. I don't know. It doesn't mean no, it just means I don't know. I have no information about that. And in terms of involving other groups of people, I think, for example, one thing that we should do, at least in academia, is to do research with schools, with high schools, for example, so that information percolates down at lower levels pretty quickly to explain how to use, for example, Wikipedia and what you could contribute, and then have high schoolers go do projects. They always have to do, at least in the Netherlands, they always have to do societal impact projects. They could go work with older people and help them on the technological side, because older people sometimes are not skilled, but they have a lot of knowledge that could be used to be put into Wikipedia, for example. And then you just do 2 things at once, catch, 2 birds with 1 stone.
Great. Another question behind?
Hi, thanks for the engaging talk. I want to ask about the open letter. Maybe you remember some time ago when the ChatGPT appeared, there was an open letter with the request to stop it for half a year to develop the rules, how we should use it. What do you think about it? Will it help?
Yeah, I did not sign the letter, disclosure.
Thank you.
I agree with some of the content, but I didn't agree with the framing, so I didn't sign it. And I think there's to me, something which is a wrong conflation of research and deployment. So I think research should not be halted. I don't think we should halt research in AI because that also includes regulations, it includes safety, it includes progress of all sorts, and it's very challenging and fascinating for everyone. And I think that's actually, we shouldn't stop that. What we should maybe control a little bit more is the way that systems are deployed to the general public with zero control. To do that, I don't think we actually need to stop research in AI, but we need to have a good conversation also with policymakers about this. And it's the same, like, if you have a not fully tested car, you're not going to release it, but it doesn't mean that you're stopping research into finding out how actually to make it safer, to make it better, I think it's a different thing, and I didn't like the framing of the letter, personally.
Great, thank you. Maybe a question that was already posted. So what is your take on having large language models that reflect either the world accurately, along with its social inequalities and differences, versus an utopian, fair, and unbiased world?
Yeah, I love this question, because this is something I really think about a lot. So there's this gap, let's say, between this tension between what actually the language models will reflect in reality, which is also like very biased, or language models that are maybe fairer. But to me, the problem, and that is also why I'm not a huge fan, for example, of debiasing models, is that who decides what's fair and what's not fair? So according to which idealistic world would you actually debias models? And it's very, to me, it's not obvious at all how you would go about this. So in a way, I'm more in favor of a model that actually is realistic, but then with a lot of awareness, and then regulated somehow at other stages, where you can do further pre-training, you can do fine-tuning, and you can do a lot of, it's also a mirror of society, and the moment that you start to do censorship, well, A, you don't fully do it, because then, bias comes back with different prompting, and so it's not that if you block it, that... And B, you might actually, for example, with the reappropriation problem, you might actually even marginalize more communities that are already marginalized. So it's an open discussion to me how we can best address this problem, but simply censorship or debiasing crude, I am not a fan, but it's also my own personal opinion.
Great, thank you. And maybe one last question. You said unmarked gender, being male in Italian, it's the case for most languages. Do you have examples of languages with big user base where unmarked language is female?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know, but I know, for example, that there are languages where you just have no gender marking at all. So you talk and you're not expressing any gender. So.
Any further questions from the audience? Yes?
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Louder.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much for this talk. My question is more related to this very famous claim of Emily Bender that ChatGPT and large language models are stochastic parrots. Do you believe in that fully, or do you support completely this claim, or do you have some doubts about it?
So, okay, I think we have like 45 seconds to answer this question, which is like the question in the field. So for those who do not know, so Emily Bender is a computational linguist who's coined, together with other collaborators, this phrase, stochastic parrots, to refer to language models, to say these are just big probabilistic models, and it's not that they understand, or it's not that they have any feelings. They're just, based on statistics, they will just predict the next word. So I'm closer to that than to those who will say, oh, they're going to take over the world because they're like conscious and so on. On the other hand, I cannot deny, so I think they are probabilistic models, and that's what they are. By being trained, though, they also acquire some complex structures, clearly, that they are very hard to explain. Like how exact, and I find it very fascinating. We were also talking informally about this during lunch. I find it very fascinating to study how these complex structures come about. And I've seen once a comparison with starlings, the birds. The way that they form this incredible structure is when they fly, right? It's not that they, in a way, each of them will do it on purpose, but this happens. Yeah, it's an emerging property of birds, somehow, this kind of birds. So what I find is that just saying stochastic pairs to diminish them, it's good if you want to use it against the hype, conscious models. But on the other hand, I think we cannot deny that there's some other level of emerging structure that is there, or at least it would be interesting. Maybe it is actually. We know that it's only statistics. On the other hand, I think it's really interesting to study it. So probably I didn't answer because it's a very hard question to answer, but yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. Let's thank again Malvina for the great intervention.
Thank you.